My name is Max Taylor and I'm a Senior Regional Analyst at Intelligence Fusion, and I cover the Middle East, Central Asia and the Caucasus region. And this week I'm going to be talking about competition or potential competition between China and Russia in the Central Asia region. Central Asia can be a challenging region to cover due to governments in this region having quite tight control over their media. So at Intelligence Fusion, we tend to mix quite a lot of effort going into finding good sources to report on day-to-day incidents, as well as broader analysis from myself, the analyst covering the region. And with this, I produce monthly reports covering the Central Asia region, which bring together our tactical level reporting on incidents on the ground, and then merge this in with analysis regarding broader subjects such as economy, business, society, and politics. The interests of the two are pretty broad, but generally it can be divided between security and economic, I think. It's the easiest way to frame it. So Russia in particular has always seen Central Asia as part of its sphere of influence, which is a really common term used to describe the relationship between the two. And with Central Asian states being former Soviet states, there's an element of cultural connections between the two. So Russian language, for example, is a very common language in Central Asia, and often seen as an international language on top of the regional languages, as well as business connections, economic connections, and also political connections, which have sort of carried on since the Soviet era. And whilst this was quite a long time ago, these connections have persisted throughout time, albeit weakened more recently. And we can see this in, I wouldn't say the weakening of the Russian language, because it is still very common in the region. But in countries across the Central Asia region, we can see Russian language is starting to become less dominant, starting to become less used. As more and more media outlets, for example, try and switch to the local languages such as Kazakh or Tajik. But with this said, a lot of the media is still in Russian, a lot of TV is still in Russian. So with that in mind, Russia has this cultural connection with Central Asia, which perhaps China can't quite boast. Russia is also, much like China, which I'll come on to later, Russia is also very interested in the security side of Central Asia, seeing Central Asia as essentially a southern entrance into Russia from a security perspective. So what they often mean by this is the threat from insurgency and terrorism in Afghanistan, for example, and South Asia in general. Russia has often been quoted in media talking about the threat that this poses to Central Asia and therefore to Russia as well. So there's always been a security element to this relationship, and you can see this in the recent deployment of Russian soldiers to Kazakhstan, for example, during the unrest. Russia has always held significant military drills in Central Asia, seeing it as a vital part of its security of its borders and as a military district as a whole. And as a result, we've got Russian bases across the region, such as the 201st military base in Tajikistan, which is close to the border of Afghanistan, as well as other bases in Kazakhstan and elsewhere in the region. And these bases generally host quite a large number of Russian units, but these are long-term bases that have been there for quite some time. But these bases are used to extend influence to some respect. And we saw this really recently in the Kazakhstan protest at the start of January, where CSTO peacekeepers were involved in the suppression of the protests in Kazakhstan, and Russian forces were able to deploy incredibly quick, not only from Russia itself, but also using some influence from their bases within Kazakhstan already. So Russia extends its influence in this way significantly. And moving on to China, China's a little bit more complicated at times, because China, whilst it does have security interests in Central Asia, it does have bases, for example, like a base in Tajikistan, where it's developed a police base for the Tajik forces. China's perhaps more interested in the economic side of Central Asia, and it's tried to exploit what it can out of the region too. So, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, which runs across the globe, really, the Belt and Road Initiative, it sees Central Asia as quite a vital point, and as a result, there's been a huge amount of infrastructure projects backed by the Chinese, as well as other economic projects such as mining and other extraction campaigns. These projects have perhaps slipped under the radar a bit more than the Russian projects, with Russia having a much more visible presence in Central Asia. But nonetheless, you see quite frequently in Central Asian in media from the Central Asia region, you see quite a lot about Chinese projects, for example. So it's definitely growing, and whether or not it's growing at the expense of Russia, I think depends on the project in question. So the economic side of Chinese influence is without a doubt quite strong. It's got a huge amount of financial backing, but the security side, I think, really goes under the radar. So people often talk about Central Asia, and often say that Russia dominates the security sphere. And generally speaking, this is true. I'd say Russian security influence in Central Asia is substantially larger than China, but China has still got quite a strong influence there. And you can see this in a base built by Chinese forces on the Tajik-Afghan border, close to the Chinese border as well, in the Pamir region. It's quite a remote region, so not a lot is known about it, but we've seen in the past there have been reports of Chinese regular personnel deployed at this base. And more recently still, they're building a police base, again on the border with Afghanistan, which will be manned by Tajik border police personnel. So again, it's not regular Chinese personnel here, like in the previous base, but still, it creates influence for the Chinese through the security expenditure. Tension between the two comes up quite a lot, mostly because particularly in the West, actually, there's a lot of talk about the relationship between Russia and China as a whole, not just in Central Asia, but as a global relationship. And I think sometimes there's an element of wishful thinking as to how this relationship will collapse and what may potentially cause this relationship between the two to collapse. And often Central Asia is highlighted as an area where these two are competing, and therefore where there's tension. And it is partly correct, there is definitely some tension at times, and there is, for sure, there is competition between the two as well. As we mentioned, they both have security and economic interests in the same part of the world. But this tension is often overplayed and it's often over-exaggerated, I think, because what we've seen consistently throughout the last 10 years, for example, is that both sides have chosen to engage with Central Asia via international organizations such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the CSTO, which is a collective security treaty organization. And both of these are essentially security agreements, similar to NATO, but with different parameters and different aims, I guess. They're more. And then you also got economic initiatives mostly led by Russia here, such as the Eurasian Economic Union, which involves a handful of countries in the Central Asia region, as well as other Eastern European countries. So there is room for tension here, but then at the same time, as I just said, with both countries engaging via international organizations, there's this institutionalized method of engaging rather than underhand, more operating in the grey area. And it's important actually at this point to mention that it's easy to talk about Central Asia within the lens of competition between outside states. And I think a lot of people often forget that these 5 states within Central Asia are their own states. They have their own agency and they have their own action. So these states as well have not manipulated, but they've definitely balanced the involvement of these two countries in a way that avoids confrontation. So rather than trying to balance them against each other, they've tried to get them. A lot of Central Asian leaders and states as a whole have tried to get as much out of China and Russia separately as they can without actually pitting them against each other. And this is something that's often forgotten about as well. Central Asian states don't really have a preference towards one or the other, as long as, when it comes to elites, as long as the political elites are getting paid, to use a saying, then they're generally content. They're not too fussed as to where the money's coming from. But then, with this said, there is definitely room for tension, and I do think in the future we may see perhaps more confrontation between Russia and China in Central Asia. And I think this will come from the fact that at the moment, it seems that China is gaining economic influence in Central Asia at times at the expense of Russia. And it's not necessarily forcing Russia out, actively forcing Russia out of projects. It's more that China has more money to throw at these projects, whereas Russia simply doesn't. So we're finding Russia more and more often falling back on cultural links with Central Asia to assert its influence in the region, such as language, and also security links, as we saw in Kazakhstan recently with the recent riots. So at the moment, there's not a huge amount of confrontation. There's not a huge amount of tension between these two, Russia and China, but I would say there is potential for it in the future. But again, it's easy to over-exaggerate this, and it's easy to overlook the cooperation between the two sides. I think going forwards, kind of looking forwards into the future, trying to see how events may impact the relationship. I think what's happened in Afghanistan may actually have quite a strong impact on not just Central Asia as a whole, which we've already seen it has had an impact, but also on the relationship between Central Asia, Central Asian states, and Russia and China. So Russia and China generally have the same view when it comes to Afghanistan. They are willing to cautiously engage with the Taliban, but they are still worried about the Taliban's ability to prevent extremism from spreading into Central Asia and possibly Russia and China as well. So at first, Russia has taken quite a hardline stance, for example. So Russia appears to be taking a stance of, we're willing to accept your control of Afghanistan. However, if you try and extend your influence into Central Asia, we won't accept that and we will actually hit back quite hard. So as soon as the Taliban captured Afghanistan, there were military drills close to the border in Central Asian countries between Central Asian armed forces and Russian forces. So this was an element of, we're willing to accept you, but I guess is the best way to put it. And I think if events in China in Afghanistan were to continue at the rate that they are at, we can see more tensions with Central Asian states. And this is where things get quite interesting, because it's often assumed that all the Central Asian states take the same stance towards Afghanistan. It simply isn't true. So Turkmenistan, for example, has been quite open to the Taliban with its own economic link, because it has its own economic links in Afghanistan, whereas Tajikistan has been much more cautious of the Taliban. And in fact, the Taliban have got some units from a militant group often referred to as the Taliban, Tajik Taliban, or Jamaat Ansarullah, and they're based close to the Tajik border. So Tajikistan has its own issues with the Taliban right now, and in fact, there's been quite a lot of tension between the two since the fall of Kabul to the Taliban. So if these relationships were to worsen, so for example, at the moment, Russia wants to keep a cordial relationship with the Taliban, but if the Taliban were to have a very hostile relationship with the Taliban, with Tajikistan in the future, this relationship could get conflicted. This could get complicated as Russia has to balance the Taliban and Tajikistan. Because at the end of the day, Russia has to protect, via its security agreements, it has to protect Tajikistan. So this puts Russia in a difficult position, and in some respects, it also puts China in a difficult position because China simply doesn't want to see extremist groups moving into Tajikistan either. So I actually imagine both China and Russia would probably cooperate here, but it's the Central Asian states themselves. We may see a change in the dynamic. Over Afghanistan, we may see a change in the relationship. We may see a change in the strength of the relationship, for example, between Tajikistan and Russia over this dispute that they have with the Taliban. And more recently still, the Taliban are demanding that Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan return aircraft that were flown into their respective countries as security forces fled the country. And both these countries at the moment, as we film this, are refusing to give it back. And this is creating tension. And the Taliban foreign ministries address this quite, wouldn't say aggressively, but they've been quite blunt about it, demanding that the aircraft be returned. So there's definitely room for these relationships to morph. And I think in this respect, every country in Central Asia has to be seen individually. We can't just look at them as one bloc because they all have their own agency here. And in that respect, that could tamper the relationship.